If you're a guest this morning, we are in a series on forgiveness. We preach about 4 steps for forgiveness to be able to forgive someone. And then on Wednesday nights, we have workshops for folks that want to actually work through the 4 steps. Today is step 3, naming the loss. Last week, we talked about the importance of telling the story in which you were hurt by another person, and not just telling it incessantly inside and rehearsing the injury, but telling it to a safe person, having someone to listen to you. And the reason for the necessity of telling about the incident where you were hurt is that when you tell it to another person, there are natural checks that come in, and it gets you out of kind of a broken loop inside that can develop and dig a deep groove in your psyche, and it causes you to hear yourself and begin the process that is at the heart of telling the story, which is, it is a way to humanize the person who has injured you. To humanize does not mean that you look at the situation until you agree with them. It just means that you tell the story and you think about the different perspectives of the incident or incidents in such a way that you can come to see that at least in their mind, the other person had a reason for acting the way they did. Does that make sense? So last week we talked about my family of origin, and when I filled in the blanks of my mom's background and the situation that I see as an adult, the story becomes much fuller, and it's easy for me to step into a situation and say, well, I can understand why she was the way she was. It doesn't mean that I believe everything she did was right, but I have an understanding of what caused the action. It's a humanizing of the person who hurt you. The first step to being able to forgive someone is to recognize the humanity in them, and we do that best by telling the story until we can at least see it and tell it from their perspective. One more time, it does not mean that you've come to the conclusion they were right and you were wrong. It just means that you understand, at least in their mind's eye, they had a reason to act the way they did. Say amen and I'll move on. Okay, all right, well, we've got plenty of time. We're way ahead of schedule, so... So once you've told the story, and it can take 100 times or more intentionally writing out the story and talking with somebody about it until a revelation of sorts happens or something comes to your mind that kind of breaks it open for you, and you're able to see, again, not excuse, but see what was driving the other person or what caused them to act in that way. Sometimes it is the fact that they really believe that they were right, and you're at loggerheads and you disagree and think they were wrong, and that's never going to change, but at least you can make their argument. Other times, the truth is, it turns out that there's no way that you will ever see their side of the argument, and you have to conclude that they weren't well. Right? So for those that have been molested or those who have been raped or really horrible, serious things like that, you're never going to understand the perspective of someone who is in that dark place. But if you come to understand that they are a human being who acted in an inhuman way because there is illness and because there's really something broken there, that also humanizes them. Because we all act in ways that we shouldn't on more or less levels. So telling the story until you can have a different perspective is tremendously important, and it begins the work of freeing. It has been my experience, because I use these 4 steps and have religiously, if you don't mind the phrase, since I discovered them. It has been my own experience that this first step of telling the story is the most significant. Going away is the most important. It unlocks, once I can humanize people that have hurt me and can see maybe why they thought their actions were the right things, it really helps my heart to be free of bitterness and anger. It's a big deal. It's also the step that takes the longest. It can take a very long time. In survivors of the concentration camps in World War II, it is fascinating to look at the statistics and to read the recorded histories of those who survived. And one of the things we know is the people who survived were often able to humanize at least the Nazis who were closest to them, the prison camp guards and the commandant. They were able to humanize them and see them as a part of a larger power structure in which they were doing what they were also forced to do. And that seems to be a common seed in part of the strength that helped those people survive, and not only survive the camps, but once they were out, to be able to go on and find lives of joy and pursuit and good things. Being able and willing to humanize people who we have dehumanized in our memory is a very big deal. Okay, the scripture for today is an example of the tribe of Israel telling the story. And they're not happy. I will confess to you that when I was younger in ministry and didn't have the good sense to kind of pay close attention, I chose this as a call to worship. We used to have formal church with robes and the call to worship nod, if you're familiar with that. And the last line of this psalm escaped my perusal. I'll read it to you now so that you're not horribly shocked when you get there. So we're back and forth, right? I say one line, they say the next line. The congregation is due to say the last line, and here's the line that they were assigned that Sunday. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. There was a massive silence in the church when I had my people, I know, it's hard to believe that's in the Bible, isn't it? It was massive silence, right? And everybody was thinking the same thing. Wow, Creel is a short-timer, right? He is out of here after this. I came to think about that because it was really a pretty rough Sunday. When I remember how sullen and unhappy the church was at saying those words, and the silence that I didn't know how to break because we'd stumble onto something so horrible in a nice church service, my reflection now is that silence, actually, the awkwardness of it and the sullenness of it was because in the church on that day, the people told the truth about what we all sometimes think. Right? When we're angry, when we're hurt, when someone has taken something that we believe to be rightfully ours, sacred and anointed by God, away from us, we're angry enough to want physical harm or other things to happen to them, and we stumble onto a way to have church folk tell the truth about what happens in the human heart. Of course, I've learned not to go that far with the truth, so I'll read the line today. You own it, okay? The people of Jerusalem were invaded by the empire of Babylon, and Babylon, they were geniuses, right? So they would go in and they would take over small, no-account countries like Jerusalem, and they would remove all the artisans, all the educated, all of the government officials, and take them back to Babylon and conscript them. So they took the cream of the crop, the educated ones and the ones who knew how to get stuff done, and they left common laborers back in the land that they had taken so that somebody was there to build their temples, etc. This then is the story of those educated elite years later, maybe even generations later, as they remember how horrible it was to be taken from their homeland. Okay, Psalm 137. Here is their remembrance of what it was like to be taken out of their homeland and forced into servitude in Babylon. And you'll recognize, I think, the first couple lines. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept. Do you know the song? By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, oh Lord, we wept when we remembered Zion. Linda Ronstadt sang it a lot better than I do. But it was a popular song for in the 70s. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in that foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above even my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down by its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you have devastated, and happy will be those who pay you back for what you have done to us. Happy will be those who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. May the Lord add blessing to the reading of Scripture. You might have had something as devastating done to you. Whoever it is that robbed you of your innocence or of your path of life or took what you valued highly, Undoubtedly, you have thought to yourself, if I could just get even, I'd be happy, right? If I could show them how badly it hurt, if I could make them feel the way they made me feel, then somehow the cosmos comes into unity and everything will be fine. You might know that that's a lie, and it doesn't work. Here's the way that works. If you set your mind to teaching your enemy the same lesson they have taught you, all that happens is you degrade yourself and become as your enemy so that even God can't differentiate. And your enemy has now hurt you twice. They've hurt you in the first place, and they've demeaned your soul so that you became as bad as they are. That's giving too much power to our enemies. It really is. The idea that retribution, paying back, and hurting as we have been hurt will somehow bring good in the world is an insanity that we're all infected with. It is a first defense mechanism. It's the first thing that pops into most people's minds, right? I'll teach you a thing or two about how to treat me, but it never works. Think about your own life. Have you ever heard anyone say, I plotted revenge, and I went and did to my enemy 10 times what they did to me, and I have been free since that day for love and laughter and joy? It doesn't happen. The reason you don't know those stories and they're not told is we tell ourselves a lie. It's untrue. So, revenge doesn't get the job done. It doesn't do what we want. Furthermore, what we want when someone hurts us can't be attained. It is impossible. What you want when someone hurts you at your deepest level is to return to what you were before the pain. But a characteristic that God has put in all of creation is you can't ever go back. You cannot go back. You can only move forward. So our desire is to do something that will even the score, or in lieu of that, that will take us back to the way we were before that terrible thing happened. That's what human beings want when we are hurt. And it cannot be had. And I think the impossibility of our desire causes us to spin off in lots of horrible ways. But you cannot go back. You can't unremember. You can't unfeel the pain. It isn't possible. So in the Christian faith, there is great common sense and intelligence in knowing that the only path for a sane human being to desire is to move forward and to get past the time of the injury. That's why we talk about forgiveness, because try as you might, you can't go back. But you can go forward, and you can move into a stage of life that is richer and fuller and actually has more joy in it because of the pain of the past. That is an attainable goal, and that's what we talk about when we talk about the steps of forgiveness and the necessity of forgiveness. Finding a way to move forward healthy and more embracing our lives more than we do during the injury. When someone does something to you, it is a form of death. They take something from you. Call it what you will. Your innocence, your rights, since in America we're big on who has rights, right? They remove something that is yours, and that means that in the removal, a part of you dies. So the emotions that we're flooded with when we're in tremendous conflict are actually the same emotions that we are flooded with when we experience the death of a loved one. I know it's really important that you stay up at this part, right? So your psyche doesn't differentiate between the death of someone you love passionately and a serious injury by an enemy. Inside, it's the same process that's unfolding. You're dealing with death, with something being removed that you did not want removed and having to find a way forward. Not again if you're with me. Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about the stages of grief, and it's always important to say the stages of grief are not to be understood as some step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you're done. They circle around incessantly when you lose, right? For years and years and years, some of them, but they're just things that happen in response to a tragic loss, whether that loss is through death or that loss is through someone taking something from you. And they are denial and anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It's a 5-part process that contains both emotional states and intellectual work, right? So we're a combination, human beings, of intellect and emotion. And when we have suffered great loss, both of them are damaged, and we have to work through a process to restore if we can, or to move forward in both of them. In order to work through the stages, we need to avoid certain traps and snares that can just loop us into the process so that it feels like it will never end, or so that we crash in the process and it really doesn't end, and it retards the rest of our living and our relationships. The power to accomplish our work in each stage and then move forward is basically contained in the step of forgiveness that we're going to talk about today. So if you want to progress in and through all of these stages and do your work and be released to live your life, you have to be able to master and understand the step that we're talking about today in forgiveness. And that step is naming the hurt. I kind of like the phrase right-sizing the hurt, right? So you've told the story, and you have learned the perspective of the person who hurt you and been able to humanize them, though that doesn't mean that you agree with them. But inside it still feels like you're really angry and that somebody somewhere ought to do something, because it turns out you've discovered the world is not fair. And not only is it not fair, it can be downright brutal and cruel. Well, that's just the way that it feels. You may use expressions like this. If someone cheats you in business, let's say, right? You trusted, you were a partnership, and then they turn the dime, and before you know it, your half of the company is gone. You might use the phrase, "I will never be able to trust again." That's a lie. It's a universal statement. I will never be able to trust again, right? I ceded trust to this person, and they violated it, and it's such a horrible thing that it's removed my ability to trust. That's how it feels when those things happen to us. But it's not true. The truth is, if you'll do your work and pare it down, is you will never be able to trust that person again, and you're likely never going to enter into a business deal without an extra rider on the contract again, right? So you've learned the limitations of your trust, but it doesn't mean there's no other person in the world that you can trust. You just think that way in the aftermath of the injury. If you continue in a universal mindset and let the injury that's been done to you have the power to be universal in your life view, your enemy now owns you, right? They've taken away your future. If you can never trust again, right? I'll never believe in another human being as long as I live. That's how it feels. But that's just utter nonsense. You have a right not to believe in that person again, right? Especially in so much as they probably won't apologize. But it doesn't mean you can't ever trust again. There are lots of good people in this world and lots of trust to be given. And life is not worth living if you don't cede trust to somebody. So in naming the hurt, what you try to do is sort through how it feels as opposed to what it really is. Moving a step ahead, what you're doing is making the next step, which is actually giving forgiveness, a whale of a lot easier, right? Because if you have to forgive, if you have to find it in yourself to forgive somebody for taking trust out of the world universally forever and ever, you're probably not going to make it. But if you just have to forgive that person for breaking trust with you, you're likely going to ooch up on that and be able to do it. Making sense? Okay. I had a doctor friend in Longmont. I really like earnest and honest people, right? I form deep friendships with them. And Dr. Dale, I think, I probably shouldn't use his last name, told me one time that in surgery, they count sponges. Do you know about this? So they use sponges to mop up bleeding, and there's a person in the room who counts them. If you put 10 sponges in a person, how many should come out? 10. Sometimes only 9. right? So they close the person up, and they're doing whatever it is you do after you do surgery, and the counter comes back and says, oopsie, right? So this happened on a patient of Dr. Dale's. And the hospital lawyer called Dale and the crew in, and they talked about strategies, and they talked about, be careful what we say when we approach the person, right? Here's the phrase you can't use, and everybody's lining up for the mother of all lawsuits. And Dale had an insane idea. How about I just go tell her? Left a sponge in you, we won't charge you to take it out. Right? It's on us. And that's what he did. He went to the woman and said, look, we messed up, right? Things got a little complicated, and in the rush, a sponge got left in there, and we absolutely have to remove it, and really, no charge. And she said, thank you for telling me the truth. That's it. If he had lied to her, if he had tried to pawn it off on somebody else, if he had played games, if he had done something else, that lady might have felt as if she could never trust any doctor again and would never have surgery again, right? She could have universalized that. But because there was truth, and he didn't, by telling the truth, allow her to make it into, that's the dumbest people I've ever seen, I can't believe they have medical licenses, etc. It's just human beings who made a mistake and left one extra little piece of gauze in her. By being plain spoken and telling her the actual damage that was done, he was able to take care of the problem. There was no lawsuit. There was no uproar. The woman wasn't scarred forever, and Dale went on with his practice. When we're naming the hurt, we're after the same result. To get what has happened to us down to its actual size so that we can manage the damage that has actually been done, not the universal huge things that we talk about. So if someone, and I try to use kind of benign things, right? Someone lies to you for their gain, which, by the way, you may know is the whole reason for lying. My mother-in-law once said of my father-in-law, he only lies to get his way, and I was thinking, that's why you lie. Anyway, let's say somebody has lied to you, and they lied to you for their gain, to get something from you that you wouldn't otherwise have given. Well, if it enrages you, it does, right? Have your blowout or whatever. But if you're working the steps of forgiveness, you want to come to the point where you understand the only thing that has to be forgiven is that single instance of that lie. Not every bad thing they ever did, right? Not everybody who ever lied to you. Just that one lie. And you will, if you tell the story correctly in the first step, find it's increasingly easy as you reckon with the fact that they're a human being and you're a human being and you also have lied. And you've lied for gain. And you've taken things from other people, even if it was just as a child with siblings or something kind of innocent. We all do it. That's the way that it is. Now you're forgiving something that you full well understand and have probably engaged in, and that's a whale of a lot easier than forgiving some massive world-changing evil that you've blown it into. Still making sense? So you sit down and you name the hurt. And you name the hurt as specifically as you can, until it becomes a size that seems manageable. So in the case of molestation, which I can speak to because I was molested as a young man, for years I carried a rage inside, and I thought of the person who molested me as less than human, and I dreamt about being able to take their life. That's too much weight to carry around. Right? I had no one that I shared it with, and so the rage just built inside, and I made them into an impossibly evil, huge, massive, bad thing until it started to bleed into other areas of my life. When I discovered how to actually forgive, right, and came to this step, I realized a couple of things. He was ill. Had nothing to do with me. He was ill. And human beings do get ill, and they do terrible things when they're ill. And I also realized it was for a time period of less than 6 months in the entirety of my life. And I can't go back and retrieve the innocence that I had before that, but I became unwilling to continue to lug that nonsense around and let him be the great evil of my life, defining everyone and everything. So I realized I have only to forgive him for being ill and acting on his illness, and I have to thank God for getting me out of that mess. And once I realized it's just literally a small time frame in my life, and he did damage, but it's only a small time frame, right? He didn't ruin my whole life. He didn't have that power. Then I really was able to work on forgiveness and to say, right, I choose to forgive him for what he's done, and what he did was actually very limited. There's been a lot more grace and a lot more good in my life than that man could ever take away with the evil that he did. Right? Sounds simple here, complex and a long time in the making, but I want you to hear on that level, which I know is hard to listen to, the power that we're talking about. The power to actually be free from the power of evil, which perpetrates itself and grows if we don't know how to master it. And the way you master it is you right-size it. You put it in context. Here's another way to look at it. No matter what has been done to you, the worst result that can come of it is if that evil causes you to waste the rest of your life being angry about it. Which means they not only perpetrate the crime, but then they rob joy for the rest of your life. So you have a vested interest in trying to figure out how to make the thing right size, how to see it in context of your whole broader life, and get it to a size where you can forgive it. If you can't forgive the whole thing at once, right-size little bits and pieces of it and give it away to God, right? And that process we'll talk about next week, but it really is where the rubber meets the road as far as religious folk go, because it's not an intellectual thing. It is a petition of God, right? Mend my heart and allow me to be healed from the anger and the resentment, right? I give it up to you. And again, we'll talk about that next week. But these things that happen to us that are life-altering and changing, we give them too much power by the mistakes that we make. If you tell the story until you can humanize the person, and then if you look at the harm that's been done and calculate it as a part of your whole lifespan and right-size it so it's manageable, then you can truly do the work that needs to be done for you to be free of the power of the person who hurt you. And here's the deal, right? I am really an aggressive human being, right? I like to win. And that's a whole other sermon. I won't ever preach it here. And winning in this case really means doing your work so that your enemies no longer own you. It would be a crying shame. I'm in my mid-50s now, right? If my molester still had that power of my life. That would be a waste because it retarded a lot of stuff in my life, right? When God brought me to a place where I could forgive it, it was like truly a magnificent thing in my life because it set me free to have joy and to have trust and to have other things that I denied myself for a very long time. The things that we're talking about in this forgiveness series are genuinely life-altering for the better if you work through them and if you take the steps. All right, everybody doing okay as far as right-size the thing, put it in context so that it becomes a manageable size. Don't universalize the power of your enemy. They don't merit it and they don't actually have it. And the best thing to do is figure out how to forgive so that they lose their power. Now, I want to walk quickly through the steps of grief, through the stages of grief, because they bear on this right-sizing, and they have to be lived through in order for you to have the wherewithal to right-size it, because it just feels terrible. We've all seen a 2 or 3-year-old who falls down and skin their knees, and they see their own blood for the first time. Have you ever experienced that? Their life is over as they know it, right? It ruins it. They come screaming and crying and sure that they're going to die, and they can't believe that something actually ruptured the skin of their precious body. It's a pretty amazing thing. They have to work through these stages, and we actually try to help them, right? So think of the last time you fell and skinned your knee, only it may be way more serious than what I just described. The first thing that happens when you lose something is denial, and that's a way of coping with large losses that allows us to pace our grief. In Grief Share, a common thing happens all the time, without exception, every class that I've been to. Someone who has lost a loved one, many times after 30, 40 years, right, will speak of the person who is deceased in the present and in the future tense. That's a form of denial. It's not a bad thing. It's right. You can't take the whole pill of grief all at once. You got to parse it out a little bit. But there is a suspension of understanding. So they will say, right? Oh, gosh, John's birthday's coming up next week. Or I was talking with John yesterday, and they weren't talking to John because he died a year ago, right? Denial. It is operative on lots of different levels, but it is a necessary stage in kind of the numbness of grief. You accept into your soul a little bit at a time the full load of the truth. Denial buys you time to adjust to your new reality and to prepare to face what has happened. Again, out of grief share and out of loss. So one of the things that is always fascinating to me, if you lose a spouse or a close family member, the timing that it takes to clear their belongings, right? To put away things and to reclaim the space and use it in a different way. That's a really fascinating thing because it really is a barometer of how well the person is progressing through the stages of grief. Some people will literally just make a shrine, go for, as far as I know, forever without ever touching that sacred space, and that means they're stuck in denial. They just can't go and face the differences. Other people embrace it relatively quickly, and it feels like something they know they're going to have to do, and so they step into it, and they give the clothes away, and they do those things. In my own case, when I lost Karen, I want to say probably 3 months, and I just left the house exactly the way it was. And then one morning, I could not tell you why. No earthly idea. I called work and said, I won't be in today. And I knew, like a calculator in my mind, it's going to take me 3 days. And I started. And I just turned the whole house over. By the time it was done, I owned a bed and a sofa and a dining room table. Everything else was gone. That was my way of getting past the denial of her passing and clearing the house and kind of putting a foot forward into starting the process again. Denial, right, lasts for however long it lasts. You should recognize it, though, right, and understand that a part of the process is you have to continue to take in more of the pain and don't let denial set in for too long because it can be unhealthy. Anger is your primary and first reaction to loss. People get mad at God. They get mad at the drunk driver. They get mad at whatever it is. We find an outlet for our anger when we suffer loss. And that also includes, obviously, the kind of loss we're talking about when someone hurts you and you lose some innocence or you lose a piece of yourself. That anger flashes. It's a biological reaction. God built it into us, right? So that as you're being chased by the lion and he puts a claw in your backside, anger is your first reaction, and that causes you to run faster. However, if you're not being attacked by a lion, you're going to want to wrestle with the anger as quickly as you can because it'll cause a lot of troubles, right? Being angry at God is no solution. It's natural, but it's no solution. And being angry at everybody and everything around the situation does not help either. Anger is a flushing mechanism. It opens up a volume of emotions that has to come out and dumps them unceremoniously kind of in front of you. It's a kind of a throw-up mechanism. And it's okay to have anger, but boy, you don't want to get stuck in it. The meanest people I've ever met in my life, right, who are just incessantly cruel to other human beings, who are untrustworthy, manipulative, every one of them, without exception, has held on to anger. And anger drives their, right, they're not always overtly angry, but it's just a seething anger from all the wrong that's been done to them that's built up and been added onto, and it just makes them vicious and cruel. If you don't want that to describe you, really, you got to confront your anger and find a way to genuinely get rid of it. Bargaining is also a step, right? Bargaining is saying to God, if you'll make this thing go away, or if you'll make it better, or if you'll kill my enemy, then I promise I'll do something really special for you. Right? I have some ideas. Can't tell you what they are, but if you'll just make it right and put me back where I was before this bad thing happened, I'll be really loyal to you. Raise your hand if you think God takes those deals. I won't have you raise your hand, but smile at me if you've ever tried to make that deal. Thousands of times, not yet, but the scripture says knock. He doesn't make those kind of deals because the nature of his creation is that it cannot go backwards. And those deals, bargaining with God or anybody else to try to reset what has happened, is just not possible. He constructed it into the fabric of the universe. I think he loves us enough that if he had not made the decision to create the universe that way, he might let us go back. But he doesn't, because reality is God constructed everything to move forward, period. You can't go back, therefore bargaining is not going to do you any good, and he wouldn't make a deal with you that he couldn't keep. He can't reset it. He cannot remove whatever has been done to you. It's not possible. He can only move you past it. Bargaining is the stage that we're likely to stay in the least amount of time, because I think most of us know it really isn't going to work that way. If you find yourself still bargaining over some kind of pain, if God will just deliver you from it, then you will do something big for him. Know this, the big thing that you should be doing for God is letting it go. Depression, anybody have any experience with that? Having never felt it before, I don't really know what to say. I can remember, of course, days where I had not slept at all at night and the alarm clock went off, and physically and emotionally, I could not imagine that I was going to get up, get dressed, and go to the church and preach a happy message to people who couldn't be dragged through the stuff over and over and over just because I was going through it. And every time it happened, God helped me get up and figure our way through it. But boy, it's a mess, isn't it, when you're depressed? Because when you're depressed, it's not just an emotional thing, right? It's not just in your mind. It depresses everything. You're literally, your physical processes slow down, right? You just become kind of like you're walking through chest-deep water, trying to go through the motions of life, but without the verve or the excitement or the hope that carries us through most of our days. Depression is the best mechanism you have to deal with the pain that someone has caused you, if you'll use it as it was intended. When you are depressed, you're going to want to, somebody fill in the blank for me. What's the natural reaction to sadness? No, natural reaction to sadness. When you're sad, you want to cry. You can tell you guys are really, truly great Americans, right? Because no good American thinks crying is good. Yes, cry. You were designed to cry. Here's the good thing about crying. All kinds of stuff gets done that you don't have to do, right? You just, if you have the courage to let yourself go and wail through it and cry out the loss and the sadness and the anger and stuff, it'll all come out. It'll all come out like in a tidal flood. But if you think you're doing really good because every time you have that genuine emotion and want to cry, you choke it back because you're strong, wow, you're just killing yourself. Really, right? You're forcing yourself, for every 5 minutes you choose not to cry because you're not that kind of person, you're sentencing yourself to another year of misery, right? Parsed out a little bit at a time, and some of that misery will be in you so long it'll rot and putrefy and become something unrecognizable. I say this 100 times a year to people. Have you cried? No, I'm doing fine. You're not doing fine. You were designed that way. And really, right, God will take care of a bunch of stuff if you'll just use your body the way it was designed. I talked with a person recently who I asked, have you been crying? And in fact, have you been doing your work? And he said, yeah, but I got to tell you, Pastor Steve, it seems like I'm going to run out of tears. No. I don't know the biology of it, but you won't, right? I've never had a person call and say, hey, I'm trying to cry, but I can't, right? I'm all out of tears. Crying is the single healthiest thing you can do. If you are proud and don't want anyone to know that you actually have human emotions, then go in a closet and cry. Or go in the bathroom and turn on the shower and cry. But my God, cry. Cry until you can't cry anymore. And you will have reduced your sentence of grief and anger really by 70, 80%. It's just amazing to me that we so refuse this truth. And you don't have to deal with all the stuff that comes out through crying individually. It's an amazing, powerful, wonderful gift. And somehow we have stupidly talked ourselves into denying it because it's supposed to be a sign of weakness. Here's weakness, the inability to confront how terrible life can be and cry through it. Okay, sorry, I'm passionate about that. If you're crying and you want a pat on the back, call me. I'll tell you, that's great. Acceptance. At some point, If you've been active in the steps of forgiveness and you've worked your way through your grief, you're going to come to a place where you're moving into acceptance. You can't actually wake up in the morning and decide, today I'm going to take the step of acceptance. Here's how it works. You wake up in the morning someday after a long season, what seems like a long season of grief or despair or anger or whatever, and maybe even without your recognizing it, instead of grinding away on the past one more time, your mind has reset and you begin to think naturally and in a more healthy manner of the future, of what you want to accomplish, of who you want to see, of what you want to do. In other words, you begin to manifest thought and action that is a sign that you are free from the residual of the injury, right? The natural inclination to move forward. I can illustrate this for you quite easily. So Karen died, and I went through a long season of grief, all of these stages, and then I was at the hospital one time, and the chaplain was taking me on a tour of the new wing of the hospital, and I realized that she was beautiful. I hadn't seen a woman through those eyes since Karen had passed. Really, right? And I walked out to my car thinking, wow, that was a hottie. Too bad she's a minister, right? I would never marry a minister. Well, the rest of that story is, yes, you would. But that was the day when I realized the storm now has subsided. I am into acceptance, right? Because that all that means is I found myself suddenly back in life, no longer suspended animation and grieving over the past, but ready to move forward. And whether it's death or whether it is injury by an enemy, there should, if you do your work, come a time when you are surprised and delighted to find yourself back in the game, right? Ready to move ahead and not moving ahead to prove them wrong or to show them who's boss, but just moving ahead because it's your life. It's a limited engagement, and you got to get on with it and get some joy out of it. When you come to acceptance, here's the thing. I think you should really enjoy it, right? You should rejoice and be glad that in doing these things and working through these processes, you have actually engaged all the things that God gave you to bring you through the trial and into the time of deliverance, right? That's all religious language, and that's why we use it, because you actually literally are delivered from the clutches of your enemy, from the power of someone who in their brokenness hurt you and took away from you. God has delivered you. Think of the biblical themes, from slavery in Egypt to freedom, right, into the promised land. Jesus overcoming death with resurrection, new life. All of that comes into play. And its primary place to come into play in our lives as Christians is through the steps of forgiveness. If someone has hurt you, really hurt you, so that it damages you and makes you feel less than, and you engage in these steps and you do them faithfully over and over and over until they do their work, you will come to a point where the things that we say in church are no longer hopeful ideas, but they are glaring realities that you can't keep within yourself. And you'll find that the end result of being able to forgive as you have been forgiven is you can't keep the good news to yourself anymore. You want to make other people free too. That is why we preach these series. Wednesday night, 6:30, we'll be talking about naming the hurt and right-sizing it. If you're interested, come. If not, please watch the rest of the series or be here on Sunday to take the rest of the series and work these steps over and over and over again, because I promise they have all the power that we talk about in church. Will you pray with me real quick?